Well, welcome. I'm David Ball. I'm with the American Airmail Society. And in addition to collecting airmail and space event covers, I have a real interest in things polar. So polar aerophilatelity, which is the subject of the of volume two of the seventh edition, um, fascinates me. When you think of early aviation, they had their challenges in terms of having enough power to get airborne and having navigation issues, all that sort of thing. But the idea of early pioneers who are flying in places where there aren't any runways, or there aren't any navigational aids, or there aren't any maps, I find particularly interesting. So I thought, well, I'll go through my collection. I'll do a little show and tell about polar aerophilatelity. And I won't pick envelopes that just kind of flew in the Arctic or were kind of near the poles. It had to be something that actually flew to the pole or flew right over it. And it amazed me that there was actually a lot of material. And I don't have all of it, but I wanted to show you a representative sample of some of these things that polar aerophilatalists collect. But before that, I wanted to just, think about, why fly the pole? And the answers are two reasons. One is it's a way to do exploration. When people want to explore, they explore on foot, but that's not always possible. I mean, in Antarctica, long distances to walk in the real cold, you have to take all your stuff with you. At the North Pole, there actually isn't any land. It's the middle of a sea. So, you might very well be able to walk there, but you're walking on, tabular ice floes and things like that. So exploration is difficult to cover distances on the ground. Also, being in elevation, you can do aerial mapping, and that's something that the bird people did in the 30s. Was they did a lot of discovery by triangulating the mountain peaks and taking a lot of photographs from the air, and also logistics. With a lot of explorers, it's not really possible for them to carry all their food and food for their dogs and gasoline for their vehicles and things like that. So being able to do set up caches for explorers to be able to do their work. So in terms of exploration, hard to go distances over the ground, the aerial mapping and logistics. And in terms of transportation, I mean, once the heroic age is over and we're in the mechanical age, there are other reasons to fly the poles, and that is when you want to go from one place to another. Let's say you want to go from Russia to the United States. Actually, the short way to go is to go over the North Pole. And so from a defense standpoint, one of our concerns is that if we were to get attacked by Russia, it wouldn't come, coming across the Atlantic. It would come across the pole. So there are great circle routes. So a lot of the flights, it makes sense once you have navigation to be able to fly that way. Having nonstop, just going by aircraft, and the fact that going by airplanes is a lot faster. So lots of reasons to fly to the poles, but it's also kind of a challenge. I was thinking kind of intuitively when you're 5 years old, when I'm 5 years old, and somebody says to me, which way is north? Well, I would say, well, north is up, right? Because we imagine that we've got our Earth and it's suspended out in space, and you look at the North Pole and you go up to get to the North Pole. So I got that in my head that the north is up. So, for example, if you look at the Mississippi River, okay, you got on the Mississippi River and you went down the Mississippi, you went down, you went south, right? You go, or let's say you're on the Colorado River, you get on the Colorado River, you want to go south. you go down. Right? So I got that in my head. And then I look at this picture of these guys on the International Space Station, and they take this picture, and if you ask any one of them, they say, well, which way is up? Like that, but they're pointed in different directions. So being able to navigate, obviously when you're in your airplane, you got a limited amount of people, you're trying to get to some particular place, you want to be able to navigate. And one of the things that we're used to is having a magnetic compass, and that's going to end up being a problem. But so the way in which people navigate with an airplane, they start out, imagine you have a two-dimensional nebula, and you look down and you see a railroad track. And so you're flying along in your plane and you just kind of follow the railroad track, and because there are maps and it shows where the railroad lines go. And that's how you get places. It's called pilotage. Right? And the little joke amongst pilots, they say that they're flying IFR. Now, IFR means instrument flight rules, but to pilots that are kind of joking around, it means I follow roads. And that's what piloting is. But there isn't always a railroad track or a road that you can follow to the place that you want to go. So the next level after pilotage is something called dead reckoning. And in dead reckoning, if you start with some place like let's say you're in Phoenix and you want to go to El Paso, right? You have a magnetic compass, and you know how fast your plane is flying, and so you're going from this place to this place. And as you fly over a point, like say you fly over a river, you say, okay, I'm at this weight. I reached this point. It's taken me this many minutes to fly this distance because my plane flies at 112 miles an hour. And you fixed yourself at one point, and then you fly to another point. And so that's called dead reckoning. And now you would think that would be fairly accurate, but it turns out that, what if you had like a crosswind or something? Your wind's aloft and wind is kind of blowing you in one direction. So maybe even though you've got your magnetic compass that says going this way, there are issues with that too. Now, over time, there are other kinds of navigational aids. There are electronic beacons where you got a beacon that sends up a signal, and then your compass from your airplane is pointing towards that beacon, and it's telling you you're either to the left or the right of that beacon, and kind of home in and fly the beam and go that way. And there are other ways you could do celestial navigation. A lot in World War II. So you might be in a big bomber, got a navigator, and he's got a little either sun compass, or he's got he's able to navigate by the stars, not unlike the mariners did on the open sea. So in terms of navigation in aviation, there are some challenges in navigating with in the air. So fixing a position if you're over water, if it's dark, or weather is difficult. And if you get lost, the results could be dire. Earhart was trying to fly around the world, and she had to find a tiny little island that was like a postage stamp sized island in the middle of the Pacific, and didn't find it, runs out of gas. So there's some consequence. And celestial navigation doesn't work very well when you're bouncing around in the plane and there are clouds and things like that. Now, airplanes certainly move a lot faster than ships, and so it's harder in a ship. You got a lot more time to fix your positions. In aircraft, not so much. And the planes are kind of unstable. They're rolling, and you're trying to fix on the stars. Weather can be bad. A lot of these guys, they start out there in open cockpits. They get the wind blowing at them and things like that. So anyway, navigation. So I started looking at magnetic compasses, and so the Earth has a magnetic field. Okay, there's magma inside, and the Earth is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. We've got essentially this big magnet, and so the magnet has a north and a south pole. And I thought, well, I'm going to understand this stuff. So I'm going to be able to come here and tell you about this, and show you pictures of covers, and that's going to be great. And the more I read about it, the more confused I got. So, I started out on the 5-year-old, and I know that North is up. Now it turns out that the Earth is a magnetic bar magnet. And do you know where the North Pole of that magnet is? It's in the south, obviously. Where else would it be? Where else would the North Pole? But in the south. And so there's that, but it gets a lot more common. Yeah. So now so it turns out that there are 3 North Poles. Who knew? Okay. So there's a geographic pole. So what that means is, and this is antipodal. So it means that if you had a stick and you ran it through the Earth, okay, the Earth is at an inclination of 21 degrees or something like that. But if you run a stick through the Earth, and the Earth spins 1,000 miles an hour, okay, it spins around a point. So you could be standing at the top of the world, and the Earth is spinning around you. And directly opposite that is the South Pole. So from a geographic standpoint, there is a North Pole, and that's up. So I got that. But then it turns out that there's a North Magnetic Pole. Okay, so the magnetic stuff is a little aligned differently. And then there's a North Geomagnetic Pole. And this stuff ends up moving around. I mean, like thousands of miles of moves around. And then the magnetic lines, you can create whole maps of the Earth of what the declination is, how off your magnetic compass is going to be, depending on where you're flying. And I'm like, how do these guys possibly navigate? They're flying over this white expanse. Okay, there are no maps. They've got this compass that's spinning like a top. So how are we ever going to know that we're in the right place? So anyway, there's all of this stuff, and the more I read about it, the more I understood. Well, I did not put these. So let me just ask. This is only a 1-question test, okay? And I'm sure you guys are all prepared for it. So here's the question: what year was the first Arctic communication carried aloft? See, now, if you were reading your 7th edition, volume 2, you would know this, right? And since there's only 1 question, you're either going to get an A+ or less than. Anybody want to take a hazard? So the first Arctic communication carried aloft.
1860.
When?
1860.
Before the Civil War? Yeah. He's right. 1850. So it turns out that Sir Franklin was doing an Arctic expedition. He gets lost. They send a whole bunch of other expeditions to go and try to find him. And one of the things that they do is they send up balloons, and they have little notes on them, and it says, here, we're looking for you, or it's a cache of food over here, or something like that. So that's the first kind of that's kind of the first airmail or something, right? I mean, they're little slips. Okay, but they never go through the mail stream, but they were carried aloft in the Arctic. So, okay, very good. You're very smart.
But it was a trick question. I figured ahead of something.
This is the answer, right? Okay. So finally, we get to the covers. Okay. So this is the first one. This is Admiral Byrd, 1926. And what I've done is I put the catalog numbers here. So this is number 46. Number 1 is the slips of paper carried along in 1850. And here we are in 1926. And Rossler, puts these things together. And Admiral Byrd carries these. And this goes over the North Pole. The first flight over the North Pole, and he's autographed it. And you can see it's got the stamps over there on the left were stamps. It was a fundraiser for Amundsen, who the year before was going to fly to the North Pole, and so they were in Norway. They were raising money for his exploits. Now there are people that suggest so Byrd flies out of, I guess, Spitsbergen, and he's gone for 15 hours. So it's enough time to fly to the North Pole and come back. And some people say, well, they actually get to the North Pole, how did he know this was at the right place, stuff like that. The guy was a serious navigator. He wasn't really a pilot, but he was a serious navigator. And what he did was he flew back and forth over the place where it should have been, kind of thing. So I give him credit. Whether he actually flew over that one point, he did it. Okay. Now, if he didn't do it, we'll look at the next one. So this is the Norge, and it's like a Zeppelin. It's lighter than airship, and it's flying a couple of days later, and flies over the North Pole, and it ends up in Teller, Alaska. And so there are a number of wonderful covers. This is one that made the complete trip, and you can see it's got a Cinderella that goes with it. And actually, this card, which this is one of 96 cards that these were leftovers from the previous attempt, and these were also carried on the Norge. And this is the South Pole, and this is Admiral Byrd, and it's autographed by the crew. So Harold June was one of his pilots, and in the lower left-hand corner, that's Bert Balkan. He's the other pilot, and then Byrd, who's the commander and the navigator, and then Kinsley, I think his name was. I think he was a radio operator. And so they, as a matter of fact, I just saw one of these on eBay a couple of days ago, and it didn't look like much of a cover. It didn't have the autographs, it had Byrd's autograph. But the way that you can tell that this one was one that flew to the South Pole is at the bottom there, it says November 28th, 1929. It's just a little rubber stamp. That's the thing that tells you that it was on that flight. And we only wanted a couple of bucks for it on eBay. So I bid on it. It ended up selling for like $100, and they're worth $500. So you never know what you can find on eBay. This is an alternate version, also through on the first flight to the South Pole, and subsequently, someone who was in the American Airmail Society sent it to Bert Balkan and said, "Do you remember carrying these?" And he says, "Oh yeah, I did." And so he annotated that. He put his name and said Byrd South Pole flight. And this is addressed, there were several of these that were addressed to wealthy benefactors in New York City. Addressed with that. Now we kind of skip ahead. We're up to PP 247. So this is 1951, and there's a commercial guy, I think he flew for United, and his name was Captain Blair, and he did a fundraiser in a plane. He owned a P-51 that he bought surplus after World War II, and outfitted it, and he flew across the pole for a cancer charity. And these cards are not particularly expensive. This one's nice because it has its autograph on, but you can get this on eBay for about $20. And this I like because I collect drift mail. So in 1937, the Soviets started putting research stations on tabular icebergs and having them float over the North Pole. And they'd be on there for maybe a year and a half. The iceberg would break up, guys would get rescued, they'd find another iceberg and put more people on it. So I have an exhibit, a 5-frame exhibit, where 2.5 frames are these North Pole stations that the Soviets did. And the others are called T3, which is Fletcher's Ice Island. So the Americans, after the Second World War, identified the Soviets as our threat. And so they were flying missions in B-29s and B-52s around the North Pole to make sure that the Soviets weren't going to come over the pole and attack us. And as they were doing these reconnaissance flights, they found this massive tabular iceberg. So it's flat, and it was breaking off of a glacier. And so they had this enormous thing that they could see on radar, and they called it Target One, T1. Then they found a T2 and a T3. Well, this T3 was like 15 miles long by like 3 or 4 miles wide. It looked like a big aircraft carrier, you know? So they decided that they were going to put this research station. So Colonel Fletcher, who was in charge, landed on this iceberg. And so from 1952 to 1975, the United States was doing the same thing the Soviets were. And we had these floating ice islands, and we had research teams that were doing all kinds of ecological work. They were also doing sonar tests for submarines, things like that. So this is a flight that was sponsored by the National Geographic Society, and so it's canceled on the ice island when it's up out of the pole. And this one says carried on a flight from McMurdo Sound to the South Pole, and signed by John Fletcher, who was a photographer with National Geographic. And then underneath there, then it's autographed by a pilot. And the Edisto was an icebreaker that did a lot of work out that one. Here's one, the closest civilization is probably Christchurch in New Zealand. So this one is carried. And a lot of these were carried in Navy aircraft. It kind of looked like the one that's on the stand. Okay, they start out with C-47s, the DC-3, a Dakota. What are the other names? Dakota Sky. What's the C-40? Skytrain? Yeah. So it's a DC-3. It's a tail dragger, 2-engine cargo plane.
Yeah. They call them Unibirds.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, Unibirds. And then the Navy had a version of that, the R5Ds or something like that. So this is, so this is the Air Force flying this, but the Navy was flying a lot of this stuff too. And so this was carried on a flight from McMurdo to the South Pole. And this would be 1956. And then, with some of these, there are lots of them. And the catalog says that they're about $100. And you can get them in different colored cachets and things like that. So BX6 was the squadron that was responsible for being in Antarctica and supplying research teams and flying people in. So they had, that was their specialty. And it turns out that flying there is incredibly difficult because, when you're trying to land, this is all done visually, okay? You have to determine how far are you above the ground and when do you need to flare, when do you need to put down your landing gear or whatever. And when you're looking out at the horizon and you see white clouds and then you see the ground, and that's white, and there are no buildings, you can't tell, are you close to something, far away? It's quite the skill. And then all of the difficulties of doing repair work in sub-zero temperatures, and your oil is freezing. So it's quite the specialty to be doing that kind of stuff. Here at Christmas time, the 63rd Troop Carrier Group flying Globemasters, which was a larger cargo plane, flew over the South Pole, and they produced a lot of holiday cards that they sent out at Christmas. Here we've got Sir Wilkins, who in 1931 was going to take a submarine out to the North Pole and didn't quite get there, but quite the explorer. And so here he is in 1957, and this is annotated that they flew it over both the North and the South Pole. And there are a number of these, and it's a wonderful book. This was kind of an interesting flight in that the one in the middle, it looks like it's like a rubber stamp thing, but that's actually hand drawn. And on the back, it has a number of different autographs. This was a congressional junket flying in 1957. So they flew to the South Pole. I'm not quite sure what they're doing. I mean, who are you supervising? What do you know, whatever, but so it's collective. This is a lovely little one. It's got overprints from the Transantarctic expedition. And so this is flown from Shackleton Station and down to the South Pole in an Otter. So an Otter is maybe it's a deep sea aircraft. It's they call it VSOL, where it has very low landing speeds. So if a plane is very fast, it'll have swept back wings, and if it's very slow, the wings will be like flat, and there'd be fairly large wings. So an Otter was particularly well suited for landing at very slow speeds and being able to carry a fair amount for a small airplane. And so this is signed by the pilot. And I like it. It's on stationary from the expedition. And this is we're now in kind of the C-130 era, which is kind of where we're at now, where we fly both C-130s and C-17s to the South Pole now. And here they're flying stuff with C-130s, and even though you have experienced pilots and the weather's terrible and stuff like that, a lot of these planes would crash. It was just so incredibly difficult. You can imagine the surface, depending on what month you get there, is it going to be mushy? Are there going to be holes? It's not like landing on a runway, so it's a bit of a challenge. So this one's from 1960. And then there were people that would go up there in small planes. And so this is Peterson's. And so Peterson, I think she was the pilot and he was the navigator, a couple. And they fly to the North Pole in a small plane. And how people, I mean, I'm sure that the navigation was significantly improved by that. But, just phenomenal. And this guy, Fred Goldberger, was a big time pilot. I love some of the modern stuff. So this was the Rockwell Corporation decided that they were going to rent a 707 and fly around the world. So they got maybe 20 scientists and invited them and a couple of photographers and stuff, and they flew around the world. This is Colonel Rockwell, who is the head of Rockwell International. And it wasn't, they weren't authorized to carry mail. So they had to stamp on it. It says, not carried on officially authorized mail flight, but they did mail them from Palm Springs and with some others who were mailed from Los Angeles. And you can't really see the postmark in the middle one for the cachet from the Explorers Club, but that one went to the mail as well. And it's nice because they're autographed by people, and you can even see there, in addition to the commercial pilots, so there, Bert Balkan was on that flight. So here's this guy who flew, to the North and South Pole with Admiral Byrd, and he's still around. And this is 1968. And then they took a helicopter. I mean, if you can imagine, I mean, I still don't understand how helicopters fly. I mean, here they take this helicopter and it flies to the South Pole. This envelope was carried on that. And I did an exhibit of this, and I'm gonna have to pull this one out again because I was just so enamored by this. So Admiral Byrd, had several expeditions from the 1920s to the 1950s, and one of the guys who flew with him, who was on his expeditions in the second expedition, 1930s. His name was Dustin, and he decides that they're going to create a polar center in Boston for Admiral Byrd, Polar Museum, and he's going to have this fundraiser. So what he does is he rents a 707, and he gets 60 titans of industry to each pony up $10,000 a piece. And he says, okay, we're going to go on a one round the world flight. Well, they do this. This is some stationary here. This one was canceled at the South Pole. But what they do on this trip is absolutely unbelievable. So I'm on eBay and I find this collection of this stack of letters. And these are all letters from a guy who was on the flight to his wife at home. Every day he would write another letter from some other place. And so I made it a single frame around the world in 26 days. And it's delightful. And the places that this guy went, so they're floating down the Amazon, and then they go big game, and then they're on the bullet train to Japan, and then they have the private audience with the Pope, and then they are, they decide that they're just going to stop by and see the Bolshoi ballet. So they just stop in Moscow, and they take this commercial plane and they land at the South Pole, and they do all this stuff. And it's like, how is this possible? But they did it, and they never made the Polar Center, but what a wonderful trip. And this guy, they called him the Flying Grandfather, Max Conrad. He flew both in 69 and 70, and this is a big postcard on the back has a picture of his little, like, Piper Aztec or something. That's like a 4-place plane. And so he's flying all over the place. He flies from Minnesota to Minnesota. 3 world records, equator to equator, over the pole, South Pole to North Pole, around the world over both poles. And here's Peterson again doing around the world. Sheila Scott, North Pole flight. And you can see the size of her plane. And you can get like 4 people in this plane. But by this point, navigation is fairly decent, but still the idea that you have mechanical problems and you're flying out towards the North Pole, you're going to have some serious issues. But I love it when they have lots of different stamps and postmarks. This was an educational flight where around the world, and I think it was kind of like a STEM school. So it was people who were interested in science and technology, and it's signed by the captains and stuff like that. And Bert Falken was on this flight, so he liked doing it. Dick Smith, he is flying from Sydney, and he's flying in a 747 over the South Pole. And then they do a balloon. Amazing, absolutely amazing. And most of these are not signed. This one is postmarked up in the Canadian Arctic, it's signed by the aeronaut. And here's a woman who had her own company, and Brooke Knapp. And so she flies this Hitachi jet and flies it over the North and South Pole. And some of the covers were really kind of stunning. So the books that are really useful or really entertaining for people who are interested in polar aerophilology. One is I don't want to say it's a children's book, but it was one that would really appeal to like high school kids and stuff. Guy's name is it's not Giles, it's Givens or something like that, and he wrote hundreds of articles for like Aviation magazine, things like that. And so that book, Polar Aviation, is maybe 12 different stories about polar aviators, and each one is a delight to read. It's wonderful. And Challenge to the Poles by Grierson is all kind of first-person stories. I mean, you feel like you're sitting right next to the pilot, and I don't know how he got all of these stories, but it's I think a lot of them are written by the pilots, and it's a tremendous book. And then the one in the middle, the American Airmail Society, is in the 7th edition. Volume 2 was done by 2 people, Hal Vogel, who is kind of the dean of polar stuff, and David Larson. And Larson was a a material scientist at SUNY, and I met him at Washington 2006. He got me interested in polar, and he was my mentor until he passed away. So the two of them wrote this book. It's tremendous. So there's only one thing that can top all of this, philatelic things, and that's a picture of my cat. So this is Muon on the left, Lepton is on the right, and they're sisters. And we got them at 10 weeks. And at the time, they both looked like mule. They were both tigers, but they were black and gray, and you could not tell them apart. And when we got them at 10 weeks and we put them in the bathroom, they said, just put them in one little room for a little bit. It's like, no, they want to explore. So open the door and they're racing around, and I'm thinking, what are we going to name these cats? And the only thing that would come into my head was like Photon, was like running like crazy or something. But I needed two names, so I couldn't call them. So I go on the internet. I look up subatomic particles, and so you got muons. Okay, and I thought, well, one of them's kind of mewing, and the other one kept jumping from thing to thing, so that one's a lepton. So we've got a muon and lepton, subatomic particles in this group. And now there are about 6, and they do everything together. So if I'm looking for one of them, I go up on the bed, and one of them's asleep in the other one's arms. I don't know what they dream of, but I assume it seems. Thank you. Any questions about polar aeroplane?
What's the difference between the magnetic pole and the zero?
I tried to understand that. So I mean, first of all, they have something called the geographic poles, okay, is a stick, okay? Antipodal, Antipodal, podal, antipodal. So antipodal means exactly opposite. So for example, there are paired cities. You could be in a city and you say, well, the antipodal of this city is in China. If you drilled through the earth, you would end up in this other place. So that's exactly 180 degrees from where you are. The magnetic ones are not like that. For some reason. I mean, I know that the earth is not round. Okay, it's got a little bit of a pear shape to it or something. And the amount of magnetism in the earth varies. So, and you don't see it as much on the earth, but for example, on the moon, when they were doing the navigation to the moon, they found that when they were doing these, they're flying at 60 miles above the moon, all of a sudden the spacecraft will get pulled down because they would have these concentrations of I don't remember what we call it, but what is it?
Magnetism.
Yeah, well, and that's what it is. And so the magnetism, the lines of magnetism on the Earth don't produce an antipodal result. So if you are at the place that is whichever magnetic North Pole we're talking about, if you go 180 degrees, you don't end up at the south. And these things move. And I don't quite understand why they move. I mean, I understand that the core of the Earth is a spinning ball of nickel alloy or something like that. And I try to understand the North geomagnetic versus the geomagnetic North, and my head. I thought, I think I'll stick with stamps. Do you know the answer?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I did a fair amount of Googling because I thought, no, I want to understand that. I really would. Do you know anybody? You the guy with all the answers on the test?
I've heard of the geographic magnetic. I never heard of the geomagnetic. So I thought, okay.
Yeah. So apparently there are 3. And there are other places. Yeah. So apparently there are 3. And there are other places. So for example, there's the pole of inaccessibility. All right, so one of the things that they wanted to do with polar exploration, the farthest away from civilization, or the hardest one to get to, or something like that, it's actually a place. The pole of inaccessibility, the north geomagnetic, and the magnetic north, and geographic north,
What, Bermuda Triangle?
like that. All right, well, anyhow, thank you for coming. Yeah. Thank you. All right.